That's what we're talking about today. A little bit, how many people here have been to a product camp before? A few. So I've been attending and speaking product camps since, I think, 2011. One of the things I love about product camp is that it's like for the people, by the people. You get to vote with your feet. So anytime I bore you, you don't like what I'm saying, you can go on and see what the other two are. Hopefully I'm more interesting than whoever else is speaking, right? The other thing that I like about product camps is this is supposed to be a discussion, right? This isn't a lecture. This isn't me saying, well, it's me saying, hey, here's what I think, but it's also you volunteering saying, what do you think? And a lot of the ideas here I have from my, many years of experience. But I'm going to tell you, every time I've come to a product camp, either sitting out there or being up here, I learned something. That's why I do product camps. That's why I like speaking at product camp. That's why I like attending product camp. So I encourage everyone to interrupt me often with your ideas, because I will selfishly benefit from it, but so will everyone else. Is everyone down with this whole way of doing a product camp? That is, by the way, that's the the whole vision of a product camp. Probably some things you should know about me. I've been in technology for, I'm old, I have a lot of gray hair, for a long time. We'll just say a couple of decades or so. My background was engineering. I quickly saw the light and moved on to experience design early in my career. Any engineers in the audience? Don't take offense to that. I think, probably the greatest user experience guy in the world, I have a bias, is Don Norman. Don Norman went to MIT. He was an engineer, right? But wrote, many books on user experience. I've already lost my train of thought. So my career path was I started out in engineering, in fact, way back in IT, network development, database. This was in the 90s. Probably some of you weren't even born then. But there was this interesting thing called the internet happening at that time, which I thought was pretty cool. Got me interested in web development and web design, which led to things like an interest in information architecture, interaction design. Eventually I picked up Don Norman's book, The Design of Everyday Things, and said, ooh, there's this thing called experience design. What the heck is that? And my career kept on evolving. Manager, director, VP, and consultant as I stand in front of you today. And I've oscillated back and forth. Along the way, maybe about 10 years ago, I was at a big company, a big enterprise software company, and I was the director of UX, I think he was the director of development, and they were exploring this thing called Agile. It was about a decade ago. And we were buddies, we were talking about it, and I said, hey, let's make sure if we do this right, let's make sure that UX is involved in this whole development process. He goes, yeah, that makes sense, right? So we did it, we rolled it out, it turned out to roll out pretty well. I left that company and I started consulting, and my buddy, Armin Marabian, in case anyone knows him, he moved on to a company called Kofax, which I believe the office was here in Irvine. We're not in Irvine now, but here in this general area. He was hired to roll out Agile development. He brought me in to make sure user experience was a part of that. And then I went on to another client, MedNeutral, which was, get this, litigation and medical. Armin started consulting, so I was there for the UX. They wanted to have somebody do Agile, brought in Armin, he came and did that. So we had plenty of successes around that. And then 2008 happened, and I stopped consulting, and I spent about 6 years at FICO running their UX department and helping them with their Agile development also. And then when the economy seemed to get good again, I started consulting. One of my first clients out of the gate was Sony PlayStation up in the Bay Area. Again, helping them with their experience design team, but they also had that piece where Agile fit. And they said, do you know anything about that? And I go, oh, yeah. I usually work with this guy, Armin. Well, it turns out Armin had been there and gone. Didn't even know it. He was the guy who had implemented their Agile development strategy, and then I came in. But that's funny how the world works. That's a little bit about me. Any questions about my crazy career? Okay, good. So that story I just told you about Armin and working with lots of companies. I've written a few books. This is, I'm not trying to sell you, I'm just letting you know that this is my latest book. Pre-ordering just started today. Hopefully the book will be out before I have to speak next. I'm supposed to be signing them. So hopefully I can finish this damn book and get it out so I have things to sign next month. This book, I'm going to call it a booklet. I don't even think it's 100 pages, but it's very concise. It's about at least my decade-plus experience with user experience and Agile. A lot of what I'll be talking about today is in the book. There's my disclaimer. I've written some other books too. I was one of the contributing writers to the ProdBook. How many people are familiar with the ProdBook, the Product Management Body of Knowledge? So when they went to write the book, Greg and I used to work together many, many moons ago at that startup I was talking about. He brought me in. So if you've read this book, anytime you saw the words user experience and usability, that was me. I wrote it. And a few years ago, before that, Jeffrey and I wrote the Customer Experience Revolution. I think we're in a third printing now, and Jeff and I are writing the outline for the second edition. So I have a background in customer experience, I have a background in product management, and yes, I have a background in UX and Agile. Any other questions or comments before we dive in? Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is Agile software development. This is what Wikipedia says. I think it's really important that as we have this discussion that we agree on something like, what do you mean when you say Agile? What do you mean when you say user experience? So Agile software development, as you probably know, it's iterative, it's incremental, and it's collaborative. And if you read the manifesto, those are some really important points about it. There's something I want to make very, very clear because this is a stance I'm going to take, and it's going to permeate everything else I'm going to say. Agile software development is a development process. How many people here are familiar with like pragmatic marketing? Yes, so if you're not familiar with pragmatic marketing, it's a product management framework that product managers use to do their job, right? Agile is a development process. They can work together. If you're a product manager, you can follow pragmatic marketing framework, and there's even courses on how to make pragmatic, work with Agile development. But let's be very, very clear that Agile is a software development methodology. Does it scale? Yeah, I'm a big fan of scaled Agile framework. Scaled Agile framework, anyone familiar with it? Scaled Agile framework is if you're making enterprise software. So scale or Agile works great if you have a small team. They talk about small teams collaborating. If you work at a small startup, it's great. I love it. I recommend it. I wouldn't make it any other way. If you're a large enterprise software company and you need to figure out a way of scaling that, I recommend Scaled Agile Development or Scaled Agile Framework because it has, the iterative process that the developers follow, the scale part, the Agile part, and then product management has a longer cycle, and then on top of that is like the business cycle, which runs a little longer, and each one cascades. You remember how many people saw Marty's presentation? Remember the discovery line and how it fed into the delivery line? That's pretty much how scale works. In fact, a lot of things that Marty said, I will be echoing in this talk. Any comments on some bold statements I made on software development, especially from those engineers there? They'll say, no, you're wrong, it's this. Questions, comments? Yes?
How do you think this scales down?
How it scales down?
Yeah. So how does it scale down to 1 or 2 person startup?
It was actually, so Agile actually started as for small companies. The hard part was scaling it up. Being small is easy. So
the typical Agile or Scrum team is meant to be 5 to 7 people big, right? How do you think the methodology will apply in a 1 or 2 person just starting out?
Well, you're talking about Steve Jobs and Wozniacki in a garage.
Or does it even make sense to use it in a
well, first,
two-person collaboration environment?
It does, but first let's talk about, does anyone here know why Scrum teams are 5 to 7? It's good that you know that. Why?
Communication. It's easier to communicate between 5 to 7 people. Any more than that, you lose the connectivity and relationship between those people.
Yes, for anyone who didn't hear that, she said it has to do with communications. Because groups any bigger than that, you lose the communication cycle. There's also an interesting psychological effect about humans. Whenever you have a larger group of humans, they just naturally start subdividing, which is why the Scrum teams are that number. So I want to cover that point. Now your question is, you get it down to 2 people. I think Marty kind of covered this, but I'll echo what he said, about being agile or iterative, even if it's 2 people. Someone has to wear the product hat. Someone has to wear pretty much the engineering hat. Companies like Apple, Dell, HP, Amazon, all started with two guys in a garage. So you had someone like a Steve Jobs or a Bezos who was kind of the product guy, and then you have someone like a Wozniacki who was the engineering guy. He was also really good at sales, so that kind of helped also. Same thing with HP and Dell. I don't think you can get more agile than two guys trying to bang out some software, and then you have to scale from there. That was a great question. Did I answer it?
To a degree, we can take it offline.
I'm happy to take it offline. Any other questions about just the premise of agile development and it being a development process and not necessarily a pragmatic marketing framework or other type of methodology? That was my big point. If I get people to buy in on that one, the rest of this will go pretty well. So they have a manifesto. Now I have to admit, as a UX guy, I'm really jealous. We don't have a manifesto. Wish we did. I think it's cool. I want to talk about the manifesto. How many folks are already familiar with the manifesto? Yay! Well, I'm going to give you my interpretation on the manifesto and what I think it means. And I encourage anyone to say, no, it means this, or hey, what about that? I'll tell you, I had some engineers that really corrected me on this one, but I'll get to that. Individual interactions over process and tools, I can't agree more. To me, what this says is that it doesn't matter how great your process is, doesn't matter how great your tools are, if your people aren't aligned or you don't have the right people, it ain't going to work. I think Marty kind of hit on that one. I think a lot of people, I think Ben also talked about that. Any questions or comments about this idea that having the right people is far more important than any process or tool that you can introduce? It's true. It's funny, we talk about, everyone talks about, people are our greatest resources, but you see the way some of them are treated in companies today, you wouldn't quite believe that. All right, next one. Don't want to get all political. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Out of all the parts of the manifesto, I think this one is abused the most. Show of hands, abused the most. This does not mean that you don't have documentation. It is never meant that you don't have documentation. Now, if you have two guys in a garage, or if maybe you have 5 or 8 people that are sitting in the same room at the same table, you can probably get away with no documentation. But as soon as your numbers get, let's say, 10 or more, someone's going to have to write down what the hell it is that we're building and why we're building it. There's going to have to be some documentation. Now, as this starts scaling up and you have people in different parts of the world, guess what? You're going to need more documentation. As you have people around the world that speak different languages and they're in different time zones, guess what? You're going to have even more documentation. Let's say you have a high turnover rate, and every time you bring someone in, they have to understand what the product requirements are. Guess what? You're going to have more documentation. It doesn't mean no documentation. It means that at the end of the day, it's all about making working software, and we're going to make just as much documentation as we need. There's another exception, too. If you're like in aerospace, or you're making medical devices, well, you have all kinds of HIPAA compliance and other requirements where you're going to have to document everything you do. It doesn't mean no documentation. It means don't give me this big stack of things if I'm not going to read it, and it's not going to help me make this. Questions, comments on that? I'm very passionate about it, but happy to hear someone else's perspective. Okay. I think it's about as controversial as we're going to get. Well, maybe. Customer collaboration over contract negotiations. I got beat up the last time I talked about this one. So what I learned from an engineer is, in this case, the customer is the internal folks that engineering has to deal with. Again, this is a development process over contract negotiations. So what they're saying here, keyword here is collaboration, is make sure from an engineering standpoint that what it's really about is the spirit of working together and collaborating and not the negotiation. In other words, it's kind of the spirit of the requirement more than the letter of the requirement. Anyways, that's my latest interpretation as I've been educated by an engineer. Any other questions or comments around this idea, which I believe in, by the way? And the last one is responding to change over following the plan. This last one is the reason we have Agile. We have Agile because Moore's Law has come to fruition. And we're living in a world now where Moore's Law, how many people know Moore's Law? Moore's Law is about, every technology is going to continue to double and get faster and faster and faster. And we're seeing it today. We're seeing, think about the amount of time, this is going to be dated. Think about the amount of time we went from vacuum tubes to desktop computers. You guys probably remember that. Think about how we went from desktop computers to laptops. It was about half the time, right? Think about how time we went from laptops to mobile devices. It was even half the time. And now what do we see? We see mobile devices of all shapes and sizes changing every year, right? We went to this tablet thing, to this half tablet thing, to this quarter tablet thing, and it's going like this. So the technology's changing, the consumer behavior is changing, marketing's changing, everything is changing quickly. So how do you reconcile that? Because the old school, old waterfall way where you take these long stages to do things, by the time the software actually got out the door, the working software got out the door, it no longer met the market need because it was 2 years later and the needs had changed. I think we had one of the panelists talk about how even today they were working on something that was 2 years old. By the time they got done, you had to go back to the executive and say, you know what, this isn't relevant anymore. So this is why Agile exists. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how you as a product manager really have all the control over this. All right, any questions or comments about the manifesto? Yes, sir.
So it sounds really great, and I'm really glad you're going through it, and I think there's been a lot of great discussions about Agile, and every single person I know who works at every company I know says Agile is a wonderful thing that we don't actually do, and that what really happens at my company is that the CEO saw this cool thing on a website, and they told us, oh, stop building this thing, build this thing instead, but still get it done by the end of the month.
Yeah, that is the reality. So I was having this conversation with a colleague right before I walked in here, and we were talking about, think of everything you've heard today, think about what Ben shared and what Marty shared and the folks on the panel share. Everything we talked about today has been, ideally, we would do things this way, but in reality, it's this. And I beg you to keep me honest on reality, and let's honestly have a conversation about, yeah, I know we're supposed to be doing that, but we're doing this. And then we can start talking about solutions. And it may not come from me. I can't tell you how many times I've done this talk where someone says, our problem is this here. And then this person over here says, oh yeah, we had that problem and here's how we solved it. That's what I'd like to see happen today, all right? So as you have problems, we'll raise them and we'll find solutions in this room. Yes?
So to just the opposite of that, I'm actually in a scenario where my VP of product actually hired multiple product managers, so I'm one of them. And we're empowered to go out and find solutions and make sure that we are directing the board, which contains all of the, the CEO, the CEO, the CFO, and we're directing them and we're showing them, like, here are the metrics that we're going after. These are the clients that we're building this feature for, and by virtue, when we build this feature, this is the impact. Here are the case studies that we're sending to our actual
you guys
partners.
Are good product managers.
So it's like if we do all of those things, I mean, any CEO will pretty much be like, okay, well, you're making me more money, our clients are happy, and we're meeting all of our requirements that we want to meet. So why am I involved, right? So that's the kind of situation that you have to bring them to. It takes time, but there is a structure, and that's how Agile, helps us build to that. So every sprint, we're building things that mean something, and that at the end of the day, by end of the month, I'm going to send something out. It's going to be reflected on these metrics that I'm going after.
You could be giving this talk instead of me, my brother.
Well, it's just that a lot of things that, you have to think about is Agile is a way to get you to a point where
it's a tool, right?
Yeah,
it's like any other tool. It's going to help you get there. And as a product manager, I encourage you to think about it as it's like any other methodology. It's like pragmatic, or it's like design thinking, or it's like lean, or whatever it is that you want to do. You're going to adapt it. Yes.
So there was a question earlier, or not question, I guess it was a comment, and I'm kind of tie it back, that there's misconceptions about product managers, and I believe there's also misconceptions about Agile in and of itself. And I can relate to that perspective of everybody's doing Agile, we should be doing Agile, but we're not really doing Agile. So do you think from your perspective, there's a definition everybody's trying to work towards, or is it a relative definition that actually exists and it's really more about the organization trying to figure out what it works for them?
I'm going to answer it. I'm going to answer it kind of a vague way. So both of those statements are true, and here's why. True Agile, and I've been through many companies that have adopted Agile, and what happens is Agile itself is a methodology that's based on this manifesto. But there's no numbers here. There's no metrics that says you have to do it this way or that way. And I think one of the hardest things that when a company adopts Agile is to realize, number one, you're not going to, in your first cycle, you're going to do it wrong, right? Just like anything else in life. it's going to be wrong. But if you pay attention and you learn something, in the next cycle, hopefully you do it a little bit better. By the way, it's still not going to be right? And in your third cycle, hopefully it's a little bit better. And I was just having this other conversation where it's never right. I mean, you heard the panel. No one's ever made perfect software. It just doesn't exist. But what I like about Agile, and by the way, I didn't used to like Agile, but what I've learned to like about Agile, it does give the product manager that flexibility of being able to pivot when they want to pivot. And you can make Agile whatever you want it to be. You can make Agile, hey, we're going to do 2-week iterations. Or you can say, I'm going to do 4-week iterations. Hey, you can even say, I'm going to do 1-month iterations. Now, that's debatable if you're doing 1-month iterations, if it's truly Agile, but that's okay. I've been with companies that said they're looking at the product backlog, and this is when, everyone's holding hands and saying kumbaya. They're looking at the product backlog, they have a good relationship with the product manager, and they'll be honest, and they'll go, hey, I see you want this feature. For it to really be, at the end of the day, a working feature, which is kind of the objective, I know we normally do 2-week sprints, but for this one, it's going to take 4 weeks. Are you cool with that? And then the product manager has to say, yeah, I'm cool with that. Okay, so in this sprint, it's going to be a 4-week sprint. Another thing that happens how many people have been doing Agile for like more than 2 years? And you know what technical debt is, right? One of the downsides of Agile is as you do these things, you now have this backlog of technical debt. How many people have ever heard the term UX debt? Thank you very much for that. Yes, sir.
So both of a tech debt is debatable, right? I mean, it's we treat it as a part of the product, and then a product manager has to make a decision what goes into that sprint, right? Either goes features or tech debt or production defects, right?
Exactly. So depending, there's a couple ways of handling tech debt, but this goes to your, if you've been doing Agile for at least 2 years, you don't see usually in the first year, but after the second year or the third year, that tech debt starts building up. Some companies will solve it in a sprint. They'll actually have a whole sprint dedicated to tech debt to catch up. It's like anything else. It's like any other kind of debt. The longer you let it go, the bigger the debt is, the harder the problem becomes to solve. I have seen companies that have gone 4 years doing Agile, and now they have like a year's worth of tech debt, and that's a bad place to be. You don't want to be there. Yes?
I just want to add real quick to maybe answer some of these questions, because we've done an Agile transformation at our company. First of all, for product managers who haven't done Agile, I think it takes about a year of working in an Agile environment, maybe working in more than one, until you really fully understand what that means. Also, in order to transform a company, you first have to get them focused on goals. Once you get focused on goals, then it's about empowering everybody else or the teams that you've structured to go and achieve those goals.
Yeah.
So if you can do that, then you have a chance. But if you still have the backlog around, hey, I want a feature, I want this feature, then you're not going to get that across.
Yeah. And I think we heard that from both Marty and Ben about the KPIs. Right? Everyone has to be clear on what the objectives and the goals are, and make your decisions around good goals. Thank you. Anything else? 'Cause we're never going to get through this deck if we spend this much time.
You don't need to thank me.
Oh. Thank you, Siri. Thank you for chiming in. I love it when Siri just chimes in. Like I said, I'm very jealous about Agile because I have a manifesto. I wish in my discipline of user experience we at least had a common definition that we all could agree upon. We don't. We don't have a common definition. There's an ISO out there. There's an IEEE out there. There's a couple of them that I like, and I'll tell you the ones I like for the context of this conversation and why. The first one comes from the Nielsen-Norman Group. If you're not familiar with the Nielsen-Norman Group, that's Jakob Nielsen, kind of the guru of usability, and Don Norman, who I mentioned before, kind of the guru of user experience. And Todd Nosky, who's kind of the guru of interaction design, formed the Nielsen-Norman Group. Don't know why Todd is not included in the name. Good question. Anyways, their definition is user experience encompasses all aspects of end users' interactions with the company, service, and product. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, probably only 5% of the companies that I can think of actually have user experience elevated to this level. They have a guy called Johnny Ives that works there that makes sure it happens. Wasn't a funny joke? I thought that was funny. Johnny Ives. Other companies like that are, Amazon has a chief experience officer. I think he's the VP of shopping experience. It was Larry Tesler. I don't know who it is now. Yahoo did it. I know I should be using Yahoo as an example. But anyways, there are very few companies that live up to it. Just out of curiosity, how many people feel that they that they are a company where experience has been elevated all the way up to the service and product? Yes? Bravo. So you guys have like a chief experience officer in your company?
The company, in the division we do.
Awesome. Good to hear. So yes.
We have a VP of UX, and then we also have a UX resource dedicated to the product.
Nice. And I know here at Hulu, oh my God, it's been a long day. They have an SVP of UX, so that's pretty cool. The definition of user experience that I think most people can relate to, this comes from Apple development. It encompasses, for applications, since we're talking about software, visual appearance, interaction behavior, and assistive capabilities. Think of visual design, interaction design, and usability, and maybe accessibility also. So I think most people, most companies are at this level. I mean, feel that you're at least at this level in your company. Oh wow, that leaves the majority of people aren't doing. How many people are doing no UX whatsoever in their company? All right, well, someone didn't fall in one of those two buckets. So there's a bucket I'm missing. Any questions or comments around these definitions or these ideas around what user experience is? 'Cause we're going to move on from what we thought Agile is and what UX is.
So can you repeat what is assistive capability?
Think about it as usability or accessibility, depending on the company.
Okay.
And it could be both. So usability is how easy it is to use, right? Usually measured by efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction, which is, by the way, the definition of usability. Yeah, I know. Or accessibility. How many folks here have to deal with accessibility with your product? We got one or two, yeah. So you know the various types of compliance, both in the US or globally, that you have to do. Accessibility gets into things like how do you deal with people who are deaf, like if they use a screen reader to use your product, or if they're hard of sight, do you support things like that? Is there enough contrast? Things like that. Good question. Any other questions around these definitions? All right. So from my experience, there are really just 3 UX activities. There's research, design, and test. It really comes down to that. Always has, I think it always will. Within this, there can be lots of roles. There can be folks that do research, like ethnographers, to throw a fancy word out there. There can be people that do usability testing. Those could be the people that schedule it and the ones that actually run the test. There are interaction designers. There are graphic designers. If you make a hardware product, there's industrial designers. In some cases, there might be textile designers, depending on what form your product takes. And a slew of other specialties, depending on what is the experience you're delivering. Service design fits into this model also. So maybe it's not just product, but also service. And service designers could also be a part of that. You get into things like wayfinding, right? So if you're designing the experience, let's say in a hospital, and you have to help patients figure out how to get to the emergency room, it gets into a whole field called wayfinding. I could go on and on and on, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many roles that you have or what you're building, you're gonna end up doing these 3 things. You're gonna figure out who your target audience is, you're gonna do iterative design to make sure you build the right thing, and then you're gonna evaluate it to make sure that you did that. Any questions about that? No? Okay. Is there any experienced designers in the room? Just the one guy in the back? Are you okay with that? Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think
Works for
3
you?
big buckets, and there's a lot of stuff in those buckets.
That's right. We'll talk about those buckets. I didn't come up with this. I found this on the internet. This thing, the internet's pretty cool. I will give credit to QBurst that came up with this diagram. What I liked about this diagram is, it illustrates kind of the point that I was making. A lot of folks who approach Agile development, especially if they're on the engineering side of it, the world kind of begins with the sprint backlog, and then the sprint backlog, leads into their iterative sprint cycles and their daily scrums, and there's a release. Yay! What we don't talk about enough, especially if you're a product manager, is how did they make that sprint backlog? Oh, they made it from this thing called the product backlog. Well, how did things get into that product backlog? Well, there's a bunch of product managers that wrote a bunch of requirements, right, to get in that product backlog so they could make the sprint backlog so they could build what they needed to build. UX is on this side of the equation. And in fact, in most companies that I know of, most software companies, UX usually reports into product, or is all on its own? Just out of curiosity, how many folks here have a UX department? Keep your hands up, please. How many of those have it report into engineering? How many of those have it report into product? Oh, I'm glad to see that transformation. How many have it as an independent group from product or experience? Wow, very sophisticated, very sophisticated. This is, for me, having been in the field for too long, I've seen the evolution of user experience start in the bowels of engineering and eventually be a part of the product team. And like I said, with really big companies, it can be its own entity. By the way, that's not always right. I'll be very, very clear. It's not that it's better that UX is independent from product or engineering or belongs in product rather than engineering. It all depends on your business and what you want to do. I'll get to that. If you're, for example, if you're making a product for engineers, right? Then your engineers who are building it, probably they're your persona. Let UX be in engineering. So Oracle's a great example. They make products for engineers, by engineers. Yeah, put it in engineering. It makes sense. Yes.
With agile teams, though, shouldn't they just be part of the team, rather than separating it out into here's UX, here's product, here's whatever? With agile, you've got a team that have those team members. So
you're talking about the agile development process,
Yeah.
where their goal is to develop and test code.
Yeah, but the agile process has the discovery and all that along with it.
They
as
do
well,
have
right?
discovery.
So-
They have discovery of what are the requirements that I need to build to.
right.
So this is the important distinction I'm making, is that where I've seen it be successful for the engineers to be able to focus on development and testing. The better the requirements that they get, the better this cycle goes.
Yeah, but how are the engineers involved in creating those? Like, do you bring the engineers back into that process?
Good
Before
question.
everything ever happens?
Yes, I do. In fact, if I may quote myself, there is no technology solution until a technologist is involved in that solution. So I'm a true believer that you get whoever your lead engineer is involved at the beginning of this process. I will tell you many times, when I was a designer, I would design something, I thought it was completely intuitive, it made a bunch of sense, and then I'd sit down with my lead architect. By the way, I've been in architecture 3 or 4 times in my career, so I have a high respect for engineers and architects. And he'd look at my design, and he'd shake his head, and he goes, we don't need all those steps, we have this widget that does that. I was like, oh, I didn't know, right? I think Marty talked about this too, that if you get the engineers involved early in the process, they can say, you don't even need to do that. We already have this thing that does that. And it's true, the engineers really do. They're the biggest I think I'm a technology geek. My engineer friends, they're way bigger technology geeks. They're way ahead of me in this stuff. It was just like you said about product managers. A lot of product managers make this mistake that, oh, I know a lot about technology. I'm going to define this, this, and this. But if they don't involve an engineer and an architect early on in the process, and they think their idea is so wonderful, they get here, you're about ready to spend a lot of money in development, and an engineer goes, whoa, why did you even come up with this thing? Because if you would have talked to me back here, I would have told you that you don't even need to do it that way. We got this thing. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
I come from a pretty heavy engineering background, and that too, more of the backend systems.
Mhm.
So when you say user experience, let's say if it's a security module or something for which the processing needs to be like super fast.
Mhm.
So I understand user experience when you have a portal, a widget, an interactive thing, but there are a lot of things in software which are not interactive, but they have a huge impact on the end product.
Yes, the performance part of it. They have to be
Right.
scalable. Obviously, they still have to be feasible.
Right.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is non-user requirements, like that will affect the user experience.
Non-functional.
Yeah, non-functional
There
requirements.
can
that
still be
solve
user
that.
requirements. Technically, the audience for that widget may be a developer, and they are the user of that.
Yeah, it could be the developer as a user. Sometimes it's system to system. So I've even written user stories that how many people have written user stories? So as I want to because look, everyone here has. So I've written user stories for the system. As the system, I will do this because of that, right? So it's a user story only in the sense that it's following the format, but at the end of the day, you're saying the system's going to do this for some system reason, like performance. Yes.
I think one of the things that this is a struggle, right, to figure out how, where requirements go. I think one of the things that I have tried to do is be very clear that user stories are for users of the system, and so the whole point is like you're delivering value to a user. If there's stuff that rides along with that that has to be accomplished in order to deliver that value to a user, then that's like part of that just has to be done. It can't be done without that. But this idea of like stories that are for like people that are not really users, I think gets away from like making sure that everything that we do has value to a user. We're not just building stuff arbitrarily for the platform or for someone inside the company.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your point is that we have consumer users, right? But we also have behind the scenes admin users that have to be able to do things effectively for the consumer user to have good experience. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, not necessarily. Like for example, for example, take a stock exchange, right? On your end, you're just gonna hit the button by buying the stock, and that's what has happened at your interface. But behind the scenes, you have to make the trade at a split-second nano, performance rate to the stock market. So that takes a lot of understanding of how it should be implemented. When I see UX, it seems like it's a widget and a portal thing. So that occurs as a very minimal aspect of the whole product to me. It's not
by the way, I'm not disagreeing with you at all.
Right.
That there's definitely clearly a distinction between where the user experience ends and the whole system architecture begins. How many people are familiar with activity-centered design? Probably an old term that you do because you're a UX guy. So Don Norman, one of my heroes, activity-centered design. So Don said, forget about user-centered design because that information can be too specific and doesn't have as much longevity as when you start looking at the whole activity that your consumers need to do. I'm specifically using the word consumer because it might be an internal enterprise product and not necessarily a consumer product or a commercial product, okay? So once you know what the larger activities are, you can take those activities and you can break them down into tasks, right? And that can translate into screens, right? And then he says within those tasks, those are actions. Think about those translating into that button you were talking about. And behind the button are things we call operations. So activities, tasks, actions, and then operations. So the UX guy, who is not an engineer or an architect, would never define what the operation does or how it solves that problem. That's why we need smart engineers that the designer can say, oh, and then when they come here, they click that button. That's it for the UX guy. He's thinking about the user experience. He's not thinking about how it gets done. He's just thinking about what would be the best experience for the user, which is why I believe that UX and engineers should have a close relationship. I've always had. I think it's really important. Like I said, if you involve them early in the process, you can eliminate a lot of screens, right? Because they can say, oh, I have a backend system that does that. Or this piece of data actually lives in this database, and I can call it here, so we don't even need that screen. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Moving on. So I'm going to talk about UX in 3 stages, early, middle, and late. I think I'll talk about it in development too. So here are some of the things that UX does in the early stages. So there are heuristic reviews. That's just a really fancy way of saying that someone with some kind of design background or ethnology background would go look at something. It could be your competitor's product saying, hey, here's what I think they're doing well, or here's where we think we can best them. Or it could be your current solution. So, hey, in version 4, we're having a lot of problems with checkout. So let's make sure in version 5 we address that issue. There's contextual inquiry. That's another really fancy word. It means observation. And I believe both Ben and Marty sung the praises of observation. This is my favorite technique also, observation. There's nothing beats going out and actually looking at your customers, consumer or enterprise, actually using your solution where they use it. There's all kinds of things that you learn from doing this. I'm going to tell you, I've been out in these things. You see, for once, the lighting. Do they have appropriate lighting in the place that they're using your software? Ambient sound, is it really loud? So that's important. If you have some kind of sound response they need to respond to and they can't hear it, well, that's not a good thing now, is it? Lighting gets into the contrast, right? Do they have enough contrast on their screen, depending on the lighting? I can't tell you how many times that I'll be observing someone using a piece of software that I'm evaluating, and they have these little post-it notes because they have to have those to remind them how to do things. Or I'm going to tell you how many times I've seen someone leave the system, go to a directory, find an Excel spreadsheet that has some piece of information, get that information, and then go back into the software. How many of you guys have ever seen that, right? I'm going to tell you, when you do this type of discovery, this is where innovation takes place. This is how people innovate, because they go out, they observe, and they go, I didn't know that they had to go out in this Excel spreadsheet and get this. I need to make sure this gets in the next thing in my product. Oh, by the way, my competition doesn't know that either, right? Because they're not doing observation. Big fan of observation. Other things that you can do at the research phase is workflow and task analysis, and that's exactly what it sounds like. You know, map out what they're doing now, start breaking down the task, again, activities, tasks, and actions, so you can kind of spell out the whole thing. And personas. How many people use personas? Yay, I am a big fan of persona designs. For those who don't know what a persona is a fictional representation of a group of people that share the same goals. Oh, 10 minutes already? All right, well, we're not going to talk about personas right now. We'll talk about that later. In the mid stage, there's iterative design. Low fidelity, medium fidelity, and high fidelity prototyping. So low fidelity prototyping can be wireframes. How many people use wireframes? I expect every hand to go up. I'm going to tell you, 10 years ago I asked that question, maybe half the hands would go up. It's amazing. I love wireframes, live and breathe by them. There's all kinds of great solutions. We'll talk later about all the different types. To me, low fidelity is when you figure out the information architecture. This is where you figure out, is this the right term that my customers use? Is this the right logical grouping that they group the things in? Is this the right hierarchy? Is this how they would do it? Is this the right label? Is this the right button name? Figure all this stuff out before you figure out if it's the right icon or the right color, because that's noise. You figure this out first, this part goes a lot faster. Once you nail down your information architecture, moving on to things like color scheme and branding and iconography become a whole nother thing. And I test these things separately. I test this first to make sure it's right, and then I test this later. Because if you test them together, you don't know when at the end of the test, was it because they didn't understand the icon, or was it the wrong word? I don't know. I'm going to run another test and find out. And then last, if you're lucky enough, some kind of high fidelity prototype, HTML, if it's a web-based thing, or it could be, you know, people even make desktop products anymore, or it could be, you know, VB, I don't know, desktop product, to define the interaction design, where you take the information architecture, the visual design, and you create interaction design. And this higher fidelity prototype is when you can do a lot of usability testing. Any questions about, yes?
When you say desktop, but it also applies to mobile, right? Or did I miss?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Consider everything that I say has to do with web, mobile, even printers, right? It could be a device, right? So if it's a device, I've seen people make devices out of cardboard. And by the way, I'm also a customer experience guy, so it doesn't even have to be software or hardware. We could be talking about, we're designing a ride for Disneyland, and we want to talk about the area they're going to walk through, right, to get there. And you might create a cardboard model, right, and talk about the different things that are going to be there. So when you get into things like, again, I was talking about wayfinding symbols, just enough time. So this whole thing is applicable to anything that you're designing, software, hardware, event experiences, games, entertainment. Does that make sense? Okay, in the late stages, it's all about the different types of evaluation. There is internal evaluations that you can do with your stakeholders. Hallway, I love hallway evaluation. So you got something, you want to see if it's right. You go, you ask like 10 people. If all 10 of them say, yeah, that's right, you're good. If all 10 of them say no, then you go back to the drawing board. How many people do hallway? I love hallway. But also you might want to, depend on the size of your company and how important it is, stakeholder evaluations to make sure they know what's going on and get their buy-in. If you're lucky enough to have some subject matter experts that work inside your company. End user proxies, so they're not your actual end users, but they're someone that works at your company that, you know, has the same persona. It's really safe. This is all safe, fast ways of checking your product along the way. There's remote. There's all kinds of software now where you can do it remotely. I'm kind of old school. I don't mind, you know, starting a web conference and turning it over to the person I'm evaluating, recording the thing. It's kind of a double duty. I get the recording that I can go back and look at later. put in a report. Formal lab evaluation. So how many folks here work at a company that has a lab? I know Intuit does. I know Netflix does. So you guys do. This can be expensive, but bring people in. There's a couple ways you can do it. You can have your own usability team, or you can bring a third party to be a little more independent. They come in, you simulate whatever their work environment is. You give them some tasks to do, and then you see if they can do it. If they can't, test things like time on task, task completion, satisfaction. And then there's site visits, which it goes, again, like contextual inquiry. You got a prototype, go out, take it to wherever your user is. If you're making a phone app and you think they're going to be standing in Starbucks, I've seen a lot of companies do this. Hey, see if you can go do this right there at Starbucks. If that's your product and that's where they hang out, do it there. Or if it's an enterprise software, work it out with your customers. By the way, customers love this. Hey, we're working on version 5. You have some time where you can talk to some of your people to see if we made it easy for them to do. Oh, really? I have say in this? Yeah, of course you do. So it creates a strong bond with your customer. Any questions or comments about that? Because I got 5 minutes. Damn. Okay. Some things that UX can do in development. Well, educate. So if you're part of a UX team, developers should be your best friend, man. You should be going out to lunch with them, taking coffee breaks. I don't know, maybe playing ping pong, whatever works for you. And provide them education. By the way, there's a lot of engineers that I know that are closet user experience experts. I've ran engineers that have read more books on user experience than I have. So they exist. They really do. Like I said, Don Norman started out at MIT. Provide any kind of UX guidelines. I know this isn't very agile. We're talking about agile. But even lightweight guidelines, maybe build some things into your wireframes that can help them out. Some of the design elements. So things like your icon library or your image library. I'd much rather have the folks in UX go ahead and create the library so it makes it super easy for the engineer to go grab it and use it. Yes?
How do you feel about style guides? We have a lot of controversy over style guides.
Really? Controversies? Imagine that. Controversy over style guide. So there's at least 2 levels of style guide. So marketing should own their brand style guide. And I believe the folks in UX should be good stewards of the brand. And they should have a good relationship with marketing to make sure that that's true, right? And they should have that handshake with marketing. That's kind of a big part of it. But then there's going to be a bunch of things that happen in your product or your service that has nothing to do with branding or marketing. So therefore, UX has to come up with their own style guide. And you need a style guide because that's what's going to keep it consistent, right? The button's always going to be on the right, and if it's this kind of button, it's always going to be green. And the reason you want to do that is so your consumer of your product gets used to that. Oh, it's always going to be here. That's great. You keep on moving it around or changing the color, you're just going to make it hard for them to use. So I think you should have style guides, but I do believe there's at least 2 levels of style guides. And from my experience, most engineers, I know most testers, love style guides. The QA folks love the style guides because they write a bunch of bugs against the engineer. Hey, this is supposed to be over here. Any other thoughts on style guides? Any engineers that hate style guides? I did have, back early in my career when I was a designer and I was working on a global team and I was partnered with my engineer, and I knew a little bit, I used to write in code. We would actually write notes back and forth to each other in the code, me and the developer who lived in a different part of the US. And there was definitely some things that he wanted to change in the style of the application. What he didn't know was that module that he and I were working on was one of many modules. 2 minutes, gotta go. A couple things I want to talk about. How many people here are familiar with IBM design thinking? If the latest thing in design thinking is the loop, and this is a way of making design thinking a little more agile. No time to talk about that, but put that in your head. Another favorite of mine is Google Design Sprints. Now, how many folks here are doing Google Design Sprints? This is the bomb, by the way. Google does so many things well. Here's an example. On Monday, they map the problem. On Tuesday, they sketch it out. On Wednesday, they turn their ideas into testable hypotheses. On Thursday, they make the prototype. On Friday, they test it. Boom, 5 days. It's basically design thinking in 5 days. Doesn't work for everything, but if you have little things you need to fill out, it's just proof that you can figure things out in 5 days. What am I doing? Oh, again, I'm not trying to solicit anything here, but I do these boot camps. This will be my 3rd boot camp. This one is specifically on Agile development. It's going to be right here in Santa Monica, cross campus. How many folks have been cross campus? It's a great facility. I was happy to get it. And because of this event, I've created an early bird registration which will last for like the next 4 weeks. All right, I think that's it. All right, this is me. Thank you. How am I doing? Am I done? All right.